The husband went on vacation alone, not wanting to wait for his wife. A week later, when he returned, he discovered something unexpected that made their relationship irreparable. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Elise Carter stepped out of the towering steel and glass building in Midtown Manhattan, feeling the chilly November wind nip at her cheeks. The late afternoon sunlight cast a warm, golden hue on the bustling city streets below, but nothing compared to the warmth bubbling inside her. This was the final week of her job as a senior media strategist, and in just a few days, she and Nathan, her husband of 5 years, would finally embark on their long-awaited Hawaiian getaway. The thought alone made her walk lighter, her smile brighter. She navigated through the sea of pedestrians, the rhythm of honking horns and distant street performers fading into background noise. Elise's mind was elsewhere: beachfront sunsets, tropical drinks, and uninterrupted moments of relaxation with Nathan. Their relationship had its ups and downs, but this trip symbolized a fresh start. Or so she hoped. When Elise reached their apartment building on the Upper West Side, she greeted the doorman with an enthusiastic wave. Inside, the familiar scent of polished wood and freshly cut flowers calmed her nerves. She slipped off her heels in the elevator, relishing the sense of freedom, and stepped out on the 6th floor. The door to their apartment was ajar. Frowning, Elise pushed it open cautiously. "Nathan?" she called, her voice echoing slightly in the quiet foyer. Her heart quickened with a mix of curiosity and apprehension as she stepped inside. She noticed immediately. Nathan's suitcase, the navy one with the broken zipper, stood packed by the door. A surge of warmth spread through her chest. Had he packed early for their trip? That was unlike him. She dropped her work bag and headed down the hall, anticipation giving her steps a bounce. "Nathan, I'm home!" she called again. The faint clink of glassware from the kitchen drew her in. Elise found Nathan seated at the kitchen table, a half-filled glass of red wine in his hand. He didn't look up when she entered. Instead, he stared into the crimson liquid, as if searching for answers. The warmth in Elise's chest turned cold. "Nathan?" She tried again, softer now, approaching cautiously. "What's going on?" Nathan finally met her gaze. His expression was distant, his eyes shadowed by something she couldn't quite place. He took a slow sip of wine, then set the glass down with deliberate precision. "Elise," he began, his voice uncharacteristically strained, "I think we need to talk." The words hung heavy in the air. Elise's pulse quickened. "About what?" she asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. She glanced again at the suitcase, then back at him. Nathan leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. "I'm leaving for a while," he said, his gaze shifting away from hers. "I need some time to clear my head." Confusion washed over her. "Leaving? What do you mean, leaving? We're supposed to be going on our trip. Together." Her voice faltered, a mix of disbelief and dawning dread. Nathan shook his head slowly. "I need this time, Elise. Alone." The room seemed to shrink around her. Elise gripped the edge of the counter for support. "We planned this for months," she whispered. "Is there something wrong? Did I do something?" "It's not about you," Nathan said too quickly, his tone a mix of irritation and weariness. "I've been feeling lost, stuck. This trip is for me to figure things out." "Figure things out?" Elise repeated, her voice rising. "What about us? Don't I get a say?" Nathan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the tiled floor. "I can't explain it all now," he said, sounding almost exasperated. "I need to go. I've already booked my flight." The shock of his words struck like a physical blow. Elise stared at him, unable to move, unable to speak. She watched as he grabbed his suitcase and headed for the door. His final words before leaving rang hollow in the suddenly oppressive silence. "Take care, Elise." As the door clicked shut behind him, Elise sank into a chair, feeling the weight of her world shatter around her. Elise sat in silence long after Nathan had left, his final words still echoing in the empty room. The smell of his cologne lingered faintly in the air, mingling with the half-finished glass of wine he had left on the table. She stared blankly at the suitcase, still trying to process what had just happened. It felt like a nightmare, the kind where everything seems off-kilter and you're powerless to stop it. But this was real. An hour later, Elise snapped back to reality. Numbly, she rose from the chair, her mind racing with unanswered questions. She moved through the motions, washing the glass Nathan had used, tidying up, trying to distract herself from the nagging ache in her chest. She wanted to believe that Nathan's sudden departure was some sort of mistake, that he would return and explain everything. But deep down, she sensed a shadow of betrayal lurking just beneath the surface. Elise couldn't sleep that night. She lay awake in the darkness, her mind looping back to the years they'd shared, searching for signs she might have missed. Was there something she hadn't noticed? A hint of dissatisfaction? Elise had thought they were building something together, a life to be proud of, a partnership that could weather any storm. But tonight, Nathan had torn that illusion apart. By morning, Elise felt a burning need for answers. She scoured the apartment for any clues. She opened drawers, checked closets, even sifted through the bookshelves. When she got to the bedroom, she noticed something odd. Nathan's side of the closet was unusually empty, more so than it should have been for a short trip. There was a box shoved into the corner on his top shelf, something she hadn't noticed before. She reached up and pulled it down. Inside, she found a stack of documents, bank statements, emails, even a receipt for a flight booked 1 week prior. As she looked over the documents, one word stood out repeatedly: transfer. Her heart pounded. She went through each paper, dread pooling in her stomach as she pieced together the truth. Nathan had been slowly moving money out of their joint savings account and into his personal account. Elise's fingers trembled as she held the statements. All the money they had saved over the years, their plans for a home, for travel, for building a future together, had been funneled into his own account. Her breath caught as a horrifying realization dawned. Nathan had been planning this for a while. Unable to resist, she checked his nightstand drawer and found his spare phone. She powered it on, her hands shaking. As the screen lit up, a new message notification appeared. Elise's heart sank as she read it. "I'll be at the airport waiting for you, love. Can't wait for our trip. Sarah." The shock was paralyzing. There was no mistaking the intimacy in those words. Nathan wasn't just taking time away from her. He was leaving her for someone else. Elise's hands clenched around the phone, and for a moment, she felt a surge of anger so intense it brought her to her feet. The betrayal was raw and unforgiving, slicing through her like a jagged blade. Every sacrifice she had made, every late night, every gesture of support and understanding, all of it shattered in an instant. Determined to confront him, Elise grabbed her coat and headed out, barely aware of the world around her as she hailed a cab to the airport. She felt her heart racing, her mind spinning with hurt and rage. The streets blurred outside the window as she rode in silence. Clutching Nathan's phone like a lifeline, her jaw set with steely resolve. When she reached the airport, Elise searched frantically, her eyes scanning the crowds for a glimpse of Nathan. She spotted him in the distance, his arm casually draped around the waist of a woman much younger than her. The two looked like a couple in love, laughing and oblivious to the world around them. The sight felt like a punch to her stomach, and she couldn't tear her gaze away. This was it, her reality. Her marriage laid bare. 5 years of shared dreams, of trust and vulnerability, had dissolved into this moment, where she stood watching her husband leave with someone else. With tears blurring her vision, Elise turned and left the airport, numb with a sense of loss so profound she couldn't even process it. She stumbled through the bustling crowd, feeling invisible among the sea of travelers, all caught up in their own lives and destinations. Alone on the curb outside, she tried to catch her breath, realizing that the life she thought she had was gone. There, standing under the fluorescent glow of the airport lights, Elise made a silent promise to herself. She would no longer be the woman who waited for someone else to decide her future. She would find her strength, whatever it took. The days that followed were a blur for Elise. She moved through life as if in a fog, her mind clouded by betrayal and grief. She had returned home from the airport feeling like a ghost in her own life, haunted by memories that no longer felt real. Nathan's absence was a tangible void, but so too was the realization of who he had chosen to be without her. The man she thought she knew had become a stranger overnight. Elise's routine became mechanical. Wake up, work, go through the motions, pretend everything was fine. But in the quiet moments, late at night when the city hummed softly outside her window, she allowed herself to feel the weight of it all. The ache of abandonment, the burning questions that refused to be silenced. How had she missed the signs? Had their life together always been a lie? Determined to find clarity, Elise delved deeper into the remnants of their life together. She pored over every detail, hoping to uncover a reason, an explanation that would make sense of Nathan's betrayal. She combed through old photos, text messages, and emails. Nothing pointed to the man he had become, and that made it even harder to accept. It was as though she was searching for a ghost, an illusion of someone who had never truly existed. One evening, Elise sat in their living room, surrounded by papers and memories. She held a framed photo of their wedding day, tracing the smiles frozen in time. She had believed in that day and those vows. Her chest tightened. Setting the photo aside, she picked up Nathan's spare phone once more. It felt cold and heavy in her hand. She wasn't sure why she'd kept it. Perhaps it was a way of holding on to something tangible in the wake of their crumbling reality. This time, she scrolled through the messages with a clearer head. She read every exchange between Nathan and Sarah, piecing together their secretive affair. The texts were flirtatious, laced with promises and plans. Each word was a knife, but it was a wound she had to reopen to truly understand the depth of his betrayal. In one of the messages, Sarah mentioned a trip they had taken months earlier. Elise felt a cold, sickening realization wash over her. It wasn't a sudden decision. It was planned. As she set the phone down, Elise felt a surge of anger. For too long, she had allowed herself to wallow in confusion and self-doubt. No more. She needed to regain control of her life. If Nathan thought he could walk away with their savings and start a new life without consequences, he was mistaken. The following day, Elise called their bank. The conversation was excruciating, but necessary. She learned that Nathan had been withdrawing money for months, and the representative on the line expressed sympathy, but reminded her of the legal complexities involved. Elise hung up, feeling drained yet resolute. She would not be passive. She would not let him take everything. Elise decided to confront her fears head on. She needed to talk to someone, anyone, who could offer guidance. She reached out to a trusted colleague, Maria, who had been a close friend for years. They met at a quiet cafe on the Upper West Side. The aroma of coffee and soft jazz music created a comforting atmosphere, but Elise's nerves were frayed. Maria listened attentively as Elise recounted everything. When Elise finally finished, her voice trembling with exhaustion, Maria leaned forward and took her hand. "You're stronger than you know," she said. "Nathan's choices don't define you. He doesn't get to steal your future along with your past." The words struck a chord. Elise felt a flicker of hope, a reminder that she wasn't entirely alone. Maria offered to connect her with a lawyer who specialized in marital disputes and financial recovery. It was a step forward, a small but significant victory in reclaiming her life. That night, as Elise prepared for bed, she noticed Nathan's old notebook on the bookshelf, a journal he had kept during their early years together. She hadn't looked at it in ages. Curiosity got the better of her, and she flipped through the pages. The entries were mundane at first, notes about work, plans for dinner, but one entry caught her eye. In it, Nathan described feeling trapped and unsatisfied, longing for freedom, but unsure how to find it. Elise closed the journal, her heart heavy. She couldn't ignore that Nathan's discontent had been brewing for years, but it didn't absolve him. It didn't excuse his actions or the betrayal. Elise realized she couldn't spend the rest of her life deciphering his motives. She needed to move on. Not for him, but for herself. With newfound resolve, Elise turned off the light and climbed into bed. She stared at the ceiling, her mind racing with plans for what came next. There would be no more waiting, no more hoping for answers that might never come. The winter air bit at Elise's cheeks as she wandered aimlessly through the snow-dusted streets of New York. It had been weeks since Nathan left, yet the pain and confusion felt as raw as ever. She was no stranger to walking aimlessly after work, letting the city's bustling energy drown out her thoughts. But tonight was different. Tonight, she felt a void she couldn't shake, a heaviness pressing down on her heart with every step. As she walked through a quiet, less traveled part of the neighborhood, a sudden flurry of snowflakes began to fall, coating the sidewalk in a thin layer of white. Elise drew her coat tighter around her and ducked her head, trying to shield herself from the growing wind. She turned down a narrow alley to take a shortcut, hoping to escape the biting chill. Halfway through, she noticed a figure huddled against the brick wall, partially hidden in the shadows. The figure was a man, hunched over, his clothes worn and threadbare. He looked up briefly as she passed, and Elise caught a glimpse of his face, gaunt and weathered, with eyes that seemed empty and distant. She paused, struck by an instinctive pang of empathy that took her by surprise. For a brief moment, Elise considered continuing on, brushing off the encounter as just another part of city life. But something made her stop. Maybe it was the haunted look in his eyes, or perhaps it was a part of her that saw her own pain reflected in his gaze. Whatever the reason, she found herself turning back, rummaging through her purse. "Excuse me," she said softly, approaching the man cautiously. "Are you okay? Do you need anything?" The man didn't respond at first. He seemed almost startled by her presence, his gaze flickering up to meet hers. His eyes, though tired, held a flicker of awareness, a spark that suggested he hadn't completely given up on life. "Here," Elise said, offering him a $20 bill. "It's not much, but maybe you can get something warm to eat." The man looked at the bill, then back at her, his lips parting slightly as if he wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. He shook his head slowly, declining her offer, then turned his gaze back to the ground. Elise felt a surge of frustration. She wanted to help, to do something that mattered, even if just for a moment. On impulse, she spoke up again. "Look, I don't know. If you want, I could get you a coffee or something warm to eat. I know things are tough out here." This time, a faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there, a small hint of gratitude, of acceptance. "A coffee? Yeah, that would be nice," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Without thinking twice, Elise led him to a small cafe nearby. The warmth hit her as they stepped inside, and she could see him visibly relax, his shoulders dropping as he absorbed the comfort of the indoor heat. She ordered 2 coffees and a couple of sandwiches, then led him to a quiet corner table. They sat in silence for a while, sipping their coffee. Elise studied him over the rim of her cup. He looked like he was in his early 40s, though it was hard to tell with the weariness etched into his face. His clothes were tattered, his hands chapped and rough from the cold, yet there was a gentleness in his mannerisms, a kind of quiet dignity that intrigued her. Finally he spoke. "Thank you," he said, his voice low but sincere. "It's been a while since anyone's offered me a hand." Elise managed a small smile. I don't know. I saw you there, and it felt like the right thing to do." He nodded, taking another sip of his coffee. "People don't usually stop, you know? It's easier to just look the other way." His voice was tinged with sadness, as though he had accepted this reality long ago. For a moment, Elise hesitated, unsure if she should ask more. But something about him made her curious. "What's your name?" she asked gently. "Dylan," he replied after a pause. "Dylan Parker." "Elise," she said, extending her hand across the table. He took it, his grip surprisingly firm despite his apparent frailty. "So, Dylan, if you don't mind me asking, how did you end up here?" Her words were cautious, respectful of his space. She didn't want to pry, but there was an unmistakable depth in his eyes, a story she sensed was worth hearing. Dylan looked down at his hands, the flicker of a painful memory passing through his expression. I lost my family, my wife, my little girl." His voice cracked slightly. Elise's heart sank, her own troubles momentarily fading in the face of his pain. She leaned forward, her voice soft. I'm so sorry, Dylan. I can't even imagine what that must have been like." Dylan gave a small nod, his eyes distant. "After that, everything just fell apart. I couldn't keep up with work, with bills. I lost our home. One thing led to another, and here I am." He gave a bitter laugh, devoid of any real humor. "Funny how life works, isn't it?" Elise felt a surge of empathy, a connection she hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time since Nathan had left, she found herself genuinely caring about someone else's pain. It was as if her own heartbreak was giving her the ability to understand his in a way she never could have before. "Dylan," she said quietly, "you don't have to go through this alone. If you need help, I can try to be there for you." He looked up, surprised, as though he hadn't expected anyone to say those words to him. There was a softness in his gaze now, a flicker of hope that hadn't been there before. He nodded, slowly, almost hesitantly. Maybe I could use a friend," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. They sat in silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. For Elise, it was the beginning of something unexpected, a chance to heal through the act of kindness. And for Dylan, it was a spark, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there could still be light. The days following their first meeting at the cafe saw Elise and Dylan crossing paths more frequently. It started with a hesitant invitation to grab another coffee, then gradually evolved into longer conversations and shared walks through the city's quieter streets. Elise didn't know why she felt compelled to keep seeing him. Perhaps it was the comfort of being around someone who understood pain. Whatever it was, their growing friendship became an anchor in the midst of her turmoil. One evening, as the snow fell gently outside, Elise invited Dylan to her apartment. He hesitated at first, wary of intruding, but her insistence won out. They sat by the window, cups of steaming tea in their hands, the city's lights flickering below. Elise felt a sense of calm she hadn't experienced in months. "Thank you for letting me in," Dylan said, breaking the silence. He gazed out the window, his expression distant. "It's been a while since I felt human." Elise looked at him, her heart aching. "Dylan, you are human. You're more than what you've been through. Would you tell me more about your family? Only if you're comfortable, of course. I'd like to understand." Dylan looked up, surprised, and for a moment Elise thought he might refuse. But then he sighed, a long, drawn-out breath, and nodded. "All right," he murmured, setting down his fork. He took a sip of water, as if gathering his thoughts, and began. "I met Sarah, my wife, just after college. She was kind, beautiful. Everything I thought I didn't deserve." His voice softened as he spoke her name, a hint of warmth breaking through the sadness in his gaze. "We got married a couple of years later, and not long after that, we had our little girl, Lily." Elise watched as a faint smile played at the edges of his mouth. She could see the love and pride in his eyes, even now. But as he continued, the smile faded, replaced by a look of deep sorrow. "One summer, we decided to take a family trip upstate," he continued, his voice wavering slightly. "It was Lily's 6th birthday, and Sarah and I wanted to make it special. We rented a cabin near a lake, spent the whole day laughing and playing." He paused, his eyes distant as though he were reliving that moment. "On the drive back, we were on this narrow, winding road. It had started to rain, just a light drizzle, but enough to make the road slick. I lost control for just a second. That's all it took." Dylan's hands clenched into fists on the table, his knuckles turning white. The car spun out, hit the guardrail, and went over. I don't remember much after that. Just sounds, crashing, water. And then his voice broke, and he looked away, his jaw tense as he fought to keep his composure. "When I woke up, they were gone, both of them, and I was still here." Elise's heart ached at the raw anguish in his voice. She reached across the table, gently placing her hand over his. "Dylan, I'm so sorry. I can't even begin to imagine." He shook his head, pulling his hand back, his face hardening. Don't apologize. It was my fault. I should have been more careful, more attentive. I took away their lives, their futures, and I was left with nothing but guilt." A heavy silence settled between them, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. Elise wanted to say something, anything, to alleviate his pain, but words felt insufficient. Instead, she let the silence linger, offering him the space to process his emotions. After a while, Dylan continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I tried to go back to my life, to my job. I was a bodyguard for a private security agency. High-stakes clients, lots of pressure. But it didn't matter anymore. Nothing did. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I started drinking to numb the pain. Eventually, I lost my job, lost the house, and I ended up on the streets." Elise's heart sank as she listened. She couldn't fathom the weight he must have carried, the constant torment of guilt and regret. Yet, despite everything, he was still here, still trying to survive. It was a testament to his resilience, even if he couldn't see it himself. "Dylan," she said gently, her voice filled with compassion, "you didn't deserve this. You've been through so much, and yet you're still here. You're still fighting, whether you realize it or not." He gave a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Fighting? I don't know if I'd call it that. It feels more like drifting, existing. Sometimes I wonder if I'm just waiting for it all to end." Elise felt a pang of sadness but held his gaze, refusing to let him sink further. "But you're not alone anymore," she said softly. "Whatever you need, whatever you're going through, I'm here." For the first time, Dylan looked at her with something like hope. It was faint, tentative, but it was there, a glimmer in his eyes, a fragile thread reaching out. He nodded slowly as if he were accepting her words, maybe even daring to believe them. "Thank you, Elise," he murmured, his voice choked with emotion. "I don't know why you're doing this, but thank you." They finished in silence, but it was a comfortable one. Elise could feel the beginning of something profound, something that went beyond pity or obligation. This was a bond born of shared pain, a connection rooted in empathy and understanding. And in that moment, she knew that helping Dylan was as much about healing herself as it was about offering him solace. As they said goodnight and he left her apartment, Elise felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. She had faced her own heartbreak and discovered strength she hadn't known she possessed. And maybe, just maybe, she could help Dylan find his way back to himself, too. Elise woke up the next morning feeling a mix of apprehension and determination. Today was the day she would meet with the lawyer Maria had recommended, a no-nonsense woman named Margaret Hayes, known for her sharp mind and her ability to cut through the noise of complicated marital disputes. Elise knew it wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to take the first concrete step in reclaiming her life. As she walked through the crowded streets of Manhattan, Elise's mind raced with everything she wanted to say. She replayed every argument, every moment of betrayal, every promise Nathan had broken. But more than anything, she steeled herself for whatever lay ahead. This wasn't just about the divorce. It was about taking back her own narrative, carving out a path that didn't depend on someone else's choices. Margaret's office was a blend of modern sleekness and old-world charm, with dark wooden furniture and tall windows that let in the city's bright light. Margaret herself was just as Elise had imagined, poised, confident, and radiating a quiet strength. She gestured for Elise to sit, offering a warm but professional smile. "Let's start with the basics," Margaret said, pulling out a yellow notepad. "Tell me everything you think is relevant." Elise took a deep breath and began, recounting the years of her marriage, the gradual changes in Nathan's behavior, and the shocking revelation of his affair. She spoke of their shared savings, now drained, and the pain of discovering the person she thought she knew had become a stranger. Margaret listened carefully, occasionally jotting down notes, her expression never wavering. When Elise finished, Margaret leaned back in her chair, her eyes thoughtful. "First of all, I'm sorry you're going through this," she said, her voice softening. "No one deserves to be treated like that, but I'm here to make sure you come out of this with as much dignity and as much of what you're owed as possible." "Thank you," Elise murmured, feeling a surge of relief. For the first time in weeks, she felt as though someone was on her side, ready to fight alongside her. Margaret spent the next hour outlining their options, explaining the legal steps they could take to protect Elise's assets and ensure a fair division of their property. Elise listened intently, taking notes and asking questions. By the time she left the office, she felt more empowered, more prepared to face what lay ahead. But as she walked back to her apartment, Elise's resolve was tested almost immediately. She found Nathan waiting for her outside the building, leaning casually against the brick facade. He looked disheveled, his clothes wrinkled and his hair unkempt, but his eyes still held that familiar, unsettling glint of confidence. "Elise," he said, pushing off the wall as she approached, "we need to talk." She stopped a few feet away, crossing her arms over her chest. "There's nothing left to say." Nathan's smile was thin, humorless. "Come on, you don't really believe that. We've been through too much to just end it like this." Elise felt a surge of anger. End it like what, Nathan? With you lying, stealing our savings, and running off with someone else? You made your choice. His eyes narrowed. You don't understand. Things got complicated. No, Nathan, she shot back, her voice rising. You made them complicated. You didn't care about us. You cared about yourself. And now you want to talk? It's too late. He stepped closer, his posture shifting, becoming more aggressive. I'm still entitled to half of what we have. You know that, right? Legally, I can make this very difficult for you. Elise's heart pounded, but she refused to back down. I already spoke with a lawyer, she said, keeping her voice steady. You can try, but you won't win. Not this time. For a moment, they stood in tense silence, the sounds of the city swirling around them. Then, Nathan sneered. Fine, but don't think this is over. You'll regret making it hard for me. Elise felt a chill run down her spine as he walked away, disappearing into the crowd. She knew this wouldn't be the last time he tried to intimidate her, but she was done being afraid. She had taken the first step, and she wouldn't let him drag her back down. Later that evening, as she sat in her apartment, Elise found herself thinking about Dylan. The bond they had begun to forge over shared pain was fragile but real, and she felt a sudden need to see him. She sent him a quick message, inviting him over for coffee. When he arrived, his presence was a balm to her frayed nerves. They sat on the couch, sipping their drinks in comfortable silence. Finally, Elise spoke. Nathan was here today. He tried to scare me. Dylan's jaw tightened. Are you okay? I think so, she replied, a tremor in her voice. It just reminded me of how much control he used to have, how much I let him have. You don't have to face this alone, Dylan said firmly. I'm here. The sincerity in his words warmed her, and she nodded, grateful beyond words. Thank you. As they talked late into the night, sharing stories, fears, and tentative hopes, Elise felt something shift. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was reclaiming her life, step by step. And with Dylan by her side, she believed she might just succeed. Days passed, and Elise's resolve continued to harden. She threw herself into work, her sessions with Margaret, and preparing for what lay ahead. She was done living in fear of Nathan's manipulations. But beneath the surface, she knew another confrontation was inevitable. Nathan was not one to back down quietly, and she had already seen the lengths to which he would go to regain control. The opportunity for confrontation came sooner than she expected. One chilly evening, Elise returned home to find the lock on her apartment door scratched and partially broken. Alarm bells rang in her head. She paused, her breath fogging in the cold air. She quickly stepped back into the hallway and dialed the building's security desk. Minutes later, 2 guards escorted her inside. Everything appeared untouched at first. Then she noticed small signs, the slightly ajar drawer in her bedroom, the papers strewn across her desk. Someone had been here, searching. As the guards checked every room and confirmed the apartment was empty, Elise's phone vibrated. She looked down to see a message from an unknown number. Did you find what I left behind? I told you, it's not over. Her hands trembled as she read it. There was no doubt in her mind. It was Nathan. She felt violated, unsafe in the place she had called home for years. The next morning, she met with Margaret and shared everything, including the message. Margaret's expression hardened. We need a restraining order, she said firmly, and you need to stay somewhere safe. Elise nodded, the weight of it all pressing down on her. That evening, desperate for a sense of safety, Elise invited Dylan over for dinner. Over the past few weeks, their companionship had become a source of comfort and strength for her. She cooked a simple meal, hoping the warmth of shared company would stave off her anxiety. As they ate, their conversation flowed naturally. Stories, laughter, and moments of quiet understanding. Dylan's presence reminded her that she wasn't alone in facing this fight. But their fragile calm shattered with a sudden, loud knock at the door. Elise's heart raced, and both of them tensed. The knock was insistent, almost aggressive, piercing the thin veil of peace they had momentarily found. Dylan's expression immediately darkened, and he rose from his seat, casting a questioning glance at Elise. She stood, her heart pounding, a sick feeling of familiarity churning in her stomach. It's him, she whispered, her voice barely audible. She walked to the door, hesitating before unlocking it. Dylan moved closer, a silent reassurance by her side. As soon as she opened the door, Nathan barged in, his eyes flashing with anger. He didn't seem to notice Dylan at first. His focus was entirely on Elise. "What the hell is this?" Nathan demanded, his voice laced with contempt. "You're locking me out of our apartment, changing the locks, blocking my calls? Who do you think you are?" Elise took a deep breath, her grip on the doorknob tightening. "It's my apartment, Nathan, and after everything you've done, I think I have every right to keep you out." Nathan sneered, taking a step closer. "You think this is over, don't you? You think a lawyer and some threats are enough to keep me away? I'll make this divorce a nightmare for you if you don't play by my rules." At that moment, Dylan stepped forward, his calm but imposing presence catching Nathan's attention. "I think you've said enough," Dylan said quietly, his tone firm but controlled. "It's time for you to leave." Nathan's gaze shifted to Dylan, a flash of irritation crossing his face. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, sizing him up. "This is none of your business." Dylan's eyes didn't waver. "I'm making it my business because Elise doesn't deserve this. You've hurt her enough." Nathan scoffed, crossing his arms. "Oh, I see what this is. She's already moved on, has she? Well, I guess I should have seen it coming. Always looking for someone to fill the void, aren't you, Elise?" Elise felt a surge of anger, but before she could respond, Dylan stepped between them, his expression hardening. "You need to leave, Nathan, now!" Nathan's sneer faltered as he looked at Dylan, as though he was finally realizing he wouldn't win this confrontation. His expression turned venomous, his fists clenching at his sides. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice low and threatening. "I'll be back, and when I am, you'd better believe you'll regret this." With one last glare at Elise, Nathan stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the room, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Elise exhaled shakily, the adrenaline draining from her body, leaving her feeling weak and exhausted. Dylan turned to her, his eyes filled with concern. "Are you all right?" Elise nodded, though her hands were still trembling. I didn't expect him to react like that. I thought he might just leave me alone." Dylan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "People like him don't let go easily, Elise. But you're not alone. You don't have to face him by yourself." She met his gaze, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over her. "Thank you, Dylan. I don't know what I would have done if you weren't here." For a moment, they stood in silence, the tension in the room gradually fading. Elise felt a sense of relief she hadn't experienced in a long time, a feeling that, for once, she wasn't the only one fighting her battles. Dylan's presence had brought an unexpected strength into her life, a quiet resilience that gave her the courage to stand up to Nathan, to face her fears and reclaim her future. And in that moment, she realized just how much she had come to rely on him, not only as a friend, but as someone who understood her struggles on a level few others could. They sat back down, the air around them calmer, more settled. As they resumed their conversation, Elise found herself opening up in ways she hadn't before, sharing her fears and dreams, her hopes for a life free of Nathan's control. By the time Dylan left that evening, Elise felt a newfound clarity. She was ready to face whatever lay ahead, knowing that she wasn't facing it alone. Dylan woke up in his small rented room, the pale morning light streaming through the blinds. He stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the previous night's confrontation with Nathan pressing on his chest. He had been back in difficult situations before, but this one felt different. Protecting Elise was more than just stepping in at the right moment. It was about being there for her in ways he hadn't been able to for his own family. The thought left a bitter taste in his mouth. Shaking himself free of the memory, Dylan rose and went through the motions of his morning routine. He couldn't afford to dwell on the past. He had made a promise to himself and, in some unspoken way, to Elise. As he pulled on his coat, a sense of purpose surged within him. There were still loose threads that needed tying. Later that morning, he met Elise at a quiet cafe in Midtown. She looked tired, the strain of everything weighing heavily on her shoulders, but there was also a spark of determination in her eyes that hadn't been there before. They ordered coffee, and once the drinks arrived, Elise wasted no time. "I've thought a lot about what happened last night," she said, her voice steady, but laced with exhaustion. "Nathan's not going to back off easily." Dylan nodded. "He's used to having control over you. That's why he's acting out now, because he knows he's losing it. Elise wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, seeking warmth. I don't want to be afraid of him anymore. I can't let him dictate my life. Then we'll make sure he doesn't, Dylan said firmly. But it won't be easy. Elise looked at him, searching his face for reassurance. How do you know so much about people like him? Dylan's expression darkened for a moment. Because I used to work with people like him. People who thought they could control everyone around them, use intimidation as a weapon. Back then I was a bodyguard, handling high-risk cases. But eventually, well, life happened. He paused, taking a slow sip of his coffee. Elise waited patiently, sensing that there was more to his story. Dylan set the cup down, his eyes distant as he began to speak. After I lost my family, I couldn't go back to my job. Every decision I made felt pointless. I'd been trained to protect, to anticipate threats, and I failed when it mattered most. His voice was low, filled with regret. But that's why I can't let him hurt you, Elise. I won't let it happen again. Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Elise reached out, resting her hand on his. You didn't fail them, Dylan. You did everything you could. Sometimes life is just cruel. Dylan met her gaze, a flicker of vulnerability breaking through his usual stoic demeanor. Maybe, but it doesn't change what I feel, Elise nodded, understanding all too well. So, what do we do now? Dylan leaned forward, his expression serious. First, we make sure you're protected, not just physically, but legally. I have some contacts who can help keep an eye on things, discreetly. If Nathan tries anything, we'll know. Contacts? Elise raised an eyebrow. You're full of surprises. Dylan managed a faint smile. Let's just say I haven't entirely left that world behind. The rest of their conversation focused on practical matters. Security measures for Elise's apartment, a plan for documenting any further threats or encounters with Nathan, and reaching out to her lawyer for additional support. Elise felt a sense of relief, knowing she wasn't facing this alone. Over the next few days, Dylan stayed true to his word. He coordinated with a trusted former colleague to keep an eye on Nathan's movements, ensuring that any potential threats would be intercepted before they reached Elise. In return, Elise worked with Margaret to strengthen her case, gathering evidence and preparing for the next steps in her divorce. Amidst the chaos, moments of normalcy began to creep into their lives. One evening, Dylan stopped by Elise's apartment with takeout, insisting she needed a break from legal documents and phone calls. They ate on the living room floor, sharing stories and laughing at childhood memories. It felt almost normal. But the peace was short-lived. Late one night, as Dylan walked back to his room, he sensed someone following him. He turned down an alley, quickening his pace, his instincts on high alert. The footsteps behind him grew louder. Dylan stopped and turned, ready for whatever was coming. A figure emerged from the shadows, one of Nathan's acquaintances, someone Dylan recognized from previous encounters. The man smirked, stepping closer. "You're meddling in business that doesn't concern you," he said, his voice low and menacing. Dylan didn't flinch. "It concerns me now." The confrontation escalated quickly. The man lunged, and Dylan met him head-on. It was over in seconds, a blur of movement, a struggle, and then silence. Dylan stood over the man, breathing heavily. He knew this was just the beginning. Nathan wouldn't stop. But he also knew one thing for certain. He would be ready. Returning to Elise's apartment, he found her waiting by the window, worry etched into her features. When she saw him, relief flooded her expression. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. Dylan stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "It's handled." "But this isn't over," Elise nodded, her resolve hardening. "Then we fight." And for the first time in a long while, Dylan felt hope. Together, they would face whatever came next. The winter chill was gradually giving way to the first hints of spring. The days were growing longer, and the air had a crispness that spoke of renewal. For Elise, each sunrise felt like a new chance, a chance to rebuild, to reclaim her life, and to find strength she hadn't known existed. With Dylan by her side, she no longer felt like she was navigating the darkness alone. One morning, Elise stood at her kitchen window, sipping her coffee and watching the city awaken. She felt a strange, unfamiliar calm settle over her. The past weeks had been a whirlwind, filled with confrontations, legal battles, and moments of doubt. But they had also shown her how resilient she could be. She was determined to keep moving forward. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. When she opened it, she was greeted by a smiling Dylan, holding a small potted plant. "Figured you could use a touch of green," he said, handing it to her. Elise laughed, accepting the plant with gratitude. "I think my apartment needs all the help it can get," she joked, placing it on the windowsill. "Thank you." They spent the morning making plans, both practical and hopeful. Elise had appointments lined up with Margaret to further solidify her case against Nathan, and Dylan had meetings with his former colleagues to ensure Elise's safety. But amidst the serious conversations, there were light-hearted moments. Dylan's attempts to make coffee, and failing miserably. Elise teasing him about his taste in music, and laughter that came more easily than it had in months. As the days passed, their bond deepened. Elise found herself looking forward to the time they spent together, feeling a sense of companionship she had thought lost. Dylan, too, began to open up more, sharing stories of his past life, the good moments, the happy memories with his wife and daughter. It was a slow process, but it was healing. One afternoon, they decided to take a walk through Central Park. The sun was shining, and the park was alive with people enjoying the mild weather. Elise felt a rare sense of normalcy as they strolled along the paths, the sound of laughter and music filling the air. She glanced at Dylan, who seemed more at ease than she had ever seen him. "Thank you," she said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. Dylan looked at her, surprised. "For what?" "For everything," Elise replied, her voice soft but sincere. "For being here. For helping me find strength I didn't know I had." He hesitated, as if unsure how to respond, before finally nodding. "You've done the same for me, Elise, more than you know." They continued walking, their steps in sync. It was a small moment, but it spoke volumes, of resilience, of shared pain, and of the possibility of hope. As the days turned into weeks, new characters entered their lives. Elise reconnected with old friends who had distanced themselves during her troubled marriage. She welcomed their support, finding comfort in the familiarity of their presence. Dylan, too, began to form connections with people in the neighborhood, small gestures of kindness that slowly pulled him out of isolation. One evening, Elise hosted a small gathering at her apartment. It was the first time she had done so in years. Friends filled the space with laughter and warmth, and for a few hours, the weight of the past seemed to lift. Dylan was there, mingling easily, his eyes lighting up whenever they met hers. The sense of community, of belonging, was palpable. But beneath the surface, challenges still simmered. Nathan had not given up, and Elise knew it. There were moments of tension, of uncertainty about what the future held, but she refused to let fear dictate her life any longer. One night, as Elise and Dylan sat on the balcony, watching the city lights twinkle below, he turned to her with a thoughtful expression. "Have you ever thought about what comes next?" he asked quietly. Elise considered his question. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "I used to have it all planned out. Career, marriage, maybe even kids. But now, it's different. I think I'm just trying to take it one day at a time." Dylan nodded, understanding. "It's all any of us can do." They sat in companionable silence, the weight of their shared experiences hanging between them. Elise felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in a long time. Whatever came next, she knew she wasn't alone, and that made all the difference. The day dawned cold and gray, a stark contrast to the warmth Elise had begun to feel in her life. She knew today would be a turning point, one way or another. Margaret had secured a court date to push forward with the divorce proceedings, a necessary step to free Elise from the toxic grip Nathan still tried to maintain. But as she prepared for the day, Elise couldn't shake the feeling that Nathan had something up his sleeve. Dylan accompanied her to the courthouse, his presence a silent source of strength. As they stepped through the heavy wooden doors, Elise felt the familiar anxiety clawing at her chest. She took a deep breath, focusing on the support around her. Margaret's reassuring nod, Dylan's steady gaze. The proceedings were tense, with Nathan's lawyer attempting to paint him as the victim. Nathan sat with a self-satisfied smirk, playing his role with practiced ease. Elise's anger simmered beneath the surface, but she kept her composure. She refused to let him see her falter. Margaret was relentless. She presented evidence of Nathan's financial manipulation, his infidelity, and his attempts to intimidate Elise. With every point, the facade Nathan had built around himself began to crack. Elise watched as his confidence wavered, as he realized that his control was slipping away. When the judge called for a recess, Elise stepped outside to clear her head. The cold air bit at her cheeks, but it did little to quell the storm inside her. Dylan joined her, his expression serious. "You're doing great," he said quietly. "He's losing." Elise nodded, though the weight of it all still pressed down on her. "I just want it to be over," she admitted. "I want to be free." "You will be," Dylan assured her, "one step at a time." Before they could return inside, Nathan appeared, his eyes dark with anger. He waited until they were alone before approaching, his voice low and venomous. "You think this is a victory? You have no idea what you're doing, Elise." Dylan stepped forward, his posture protective. "Back off," Nathan sneered. "Oh, I see. Hiding behind your new friend? How pathetic." Elise's hands clenched at her sides. "I'm not hiding, Nathan. I'm done with you. You don't get to control me anymore." The rage in Nathan's eyes flared. "You think you can just walk away? You'll regret this." The tension crackled between them, a dangerous current. But before it could escalate further, security intervened, escorting Nathan back inside. Elise exhaled shakily, the adrenaline leaving her feeling drained. Back in the courtroom, the judge issued a ruling in Elise's favor, granting her a divorce and placing restrictions on Nathan's access to her finances and property. Relief washed over Elise, but it was tempered by exhaustion. This battle was over, but the scars it left would take time to heal. Outside the courthouse, Elise and Dylan stood together, the weight of the moment settling around them. For the first time in what felt like forever, Elise allowed herself to breathe deeply, to truly feel the freedom she had fought so hard to achieve. "Thank you," she said, turning to Dylan, "for everything." Dylan nodded, his eyes soft. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just glad you're okay." They walked in companionable silence, the city bustling around them. Elise knew there would be more challenges ahead, but she also knew she was no longer alone. She had reclaimed her strength, her voice, and her future. That evening, Elise invited a small group of friends to her apartment to celebrate. The atmosphere was light, filled with laughter and hope. Dylan was there, blending in seamlessly, but his eyes never strayed far from Elise. As the night wore on, they found themselves on the balcony, the city lights stretching out before them. "What now?" Elise asked, her voice soft. "Whatever you want," Dylan replied. "The future's yours." She smiled, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known in a long time. I want to start over, to build something new." Dylan nodded, a faint smile playing at his lips. "Then that's what we'll do." As they stood together, the past slowly fading into the background, Elise realized that her story wasn't over. It was just beginning, one step, one day at a time. Thank you for joining me for this story. I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to the channel to stay updated on the heartfelt stories I'm passionate about sharing. Your support means the world to me and motivates me to keep creating. I'm truly grateful to have you on this journey with me.